if the two sides want to negotiate, we can negotiate. I mean, we're two mature governments. Both governments have industries that try to keep dialogue from happening. But both governments have demonstrated, particularly during the Obama-Raul Castro discussions, that they can do it. They can do it in a very diplomatic, very compartmented way that serves the interest of both countries. But those industries, I would argue, and there's a debate among analysts in Washington, those industries managed to go in and change even some of the basic concepts of normalization. Because when normalization was launched, it was a new policy with new methods. But over time, it became clear that some people in Washington wanted to make it the old objective with new means. And that, I think, led to some confusion and led to some unfortunate delays. But on the first thing, the climate in Washington right now is very difficult. In part because, I'm an information-based sort of guy. In part because when information is not rich, when information is overly biased, we don't get the debate that we have. And this coincides with a generational change where people are basically digitally oriented, and going deep into an issue takes more time than they would like to devote to it. And they believe sometimes that a few internet searches is more important than an hour interview or coffee or lunch with somebody who worked the issue for the last 40 years.
What would you suggest to us Cubans to do about eliminating those minds in the United States that don't understand what is going on here or don't see what is happening here?
I think that Cuba as a country and the Cuban government, because it's so powerful in the media here, could do things to deepen Americans' understanding of what Cuba is about, what Cuba is trying to do. And because the mechanisms that are in place, which in the end produce good stuff, but it's slow, because it's a bureaucracy that produces it rather than the media. And I would think that the media reform law that's been under discussion for the last 10 years, 11 years here, would give the Cuban government a way to trust Cuban journalists to represent Cuba and the reality in Cuba in a way that Americans will be able to integrate. Because the Cuban government strategies, however well-intentioned, and in the end, however good they are, on things like the ataques sónicos, for example, the Cuban government package, in the end, was very, very strong. But it took forever for them to put it out. Now you have to move fast. You have to do social media, you have to do print media. You have some great channels here, Cuba Debate, even Gramma, when it wants to, can be tactically supportive to policy, but you have to get out into the tactical playing field. Most Americans, my experience, I've worked on this issue, as you know, for 32 years. Most Americans, when you go out and have a beer with them, and they say, what's this Cuba problem? Most Americans don't know that we have an embargo. Most Cubans think that Cuba has a very sexy brand. The music, the cigars, the rum, the old cars, which are, of course, not something that everybody would want to be their lead image sort of thing. But the beaches, that Cuba is a sexy brand, but they don't get to see it. And so in a way, if there were a way to increase the flow of information, more Americans would realize these are real people who are trying to do real things. I think that we have to give Cubans credit for, even if the economy is not as productive enough, et cetera, that Cubans are trying to find a new model, and that we, instead of trying to crush those efforts, should be supporting them.
In this year, the United States visitors, both Cuban Americans and Americans, are the second visitors to Cuba after the Canadians.
Right.
We have received more Americans than Spanish or Germans visitors. Do you think that could make any change? Let's suppose that amount of visitors is growing. That the question of freedom to travel, how much do you think is important to change those perceptions you were talking about?
I think that travelers do change the perceptions. And I'm glad that some people, obviously through creative means, Well, Cuban Americans don't have to be creative, but American Americans, Anglo-Americans do have to be creative, have found ways to come down, because people who come to Cuba, they go back converted not as the right-wing fears, as converted communists. They go back as converted people who believe that the United States and Cuba can get along, that we can be friends and that we can respect each other's systems. And I think that most people who are looking at things see that Cuba is not the old Soviet satellite of the past and is trying to become an independent country with a model that's different, but is a model that's good. What I would really prefer is we have the post-normalization flood of American travelers, with all of the Canadians, Germans, British, Spanish, etc., have them mix in so that they're not here alone, that the Cuban economy will rise up, because under current regulations, American visitors can't stay in hotels, and they can't do this, and they can't do that, and they can't bring home the rum and the cigars to their family to taste and see, whoa, this is really sexy stuff. And so I would really like the flow of all foreign tourists to grow up, and that the United States people be able to allow to come in with respect for our constitutional rights.
If we had closer ties with Russia and China, that would favor or not U.S.-Cuban relations?
It would make an image problem, but not a substantive problem. I think that when President Diaz-Canel did his recent tour, some media did report that he was there with Putin, which is a very, very difficult country to be seen with right now because of the invasion and occupation of Ukraine. And the China thing, because Xi Jinping is making himself into something that Americans don't understand and perhaps feel a little bit concerned about. But so some of those things, but I think that Americans who know reality and know the Cuba issue say, wait, we don't let Cuba trade. We block Cuba's efforts to trade with other people. What do we want them to do? Sit and eat dirt? Most Americans are reasonable enough to realize that if we won't trade with them and we don't want them to deal with the Western partners, what do we want them to do?
Exactly. My last question, how much do you think the discussion about security issues is a priority between the two sides? And both sides would like to begin by that. How easy is that? Security
issues in the sense of law enforcement,
yes,
in terms of drug trafficking, counterterrorism,
exactly.
Those things, those are really important, because Cuba has given us this 1,200 kilometer wide escudo, this shield, for free, with very modest resources. And that's why I was a big proponent back in the 1980s, and certainly we made it official policy during the Clinton administration to say that this has to be institutionalized. So I think it's very good. I think Americans are not educated on how important the Cuban collaboration is. Even the location of the island is because they don't know it. Everything in the American mind now is for drugs is coming through Central America. For migrants, it's coming through Central America. Even Cuban migrants are coming through Central America. I think Americans who know the issue, when we get the good information to them, know that collaboration with Cuba on drugs, on terror, on migrants is in the U.S. national interest. It's not a, quote, gift to Cuba. It's not, quote, a concession to Cuba. It's in our own interest. In fact, it's sort of in a selfish interest because we're the consumers of the drugs. And here, Cuba is blocking these drugs for us. So I think that in general terms, on these security things, because when we say security also, you think of national security, that Cuba in some quarters is still perceived as a national security threat, which I think we all know the US government has certified for many, many years that Cuba doesn't pose a national security threat. They tried to raise the issue with the so-called ataques sónicos. They try to make the ataques sónicos into something that Cuba was doing against American diplomats, or as an agent of Russia. And some people even slip and say, as an agent of the Soviet Union, and all that. But I think that all of those things have fallen away because they weren't true enough to be sustainable.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.